Hello everyone, welcome to the final video lecture for PowerPoint 1 of Unit 4 Anxiety Disorders. So in the last two videos we talked about what is anxiety, what are anxiety disorders, and then anxiety associated disorders. So now let's get into what causes anxiety. So we'll start with normal anxiety, and then what turns that normal anxiety into anxiety disorders, or what we call here pathological anxiety. So the first thing we'll talk about is Gray's biopsychosocial theory of personality. Okay, so that's biopsychosocial theory is also the BIS theory. So this is postulated by Gray in 1970, not that you need to know that, but he said that behavioral activity is controlled by the balance of two systems, okay? So we've got the behavioral inhibition system, which is the BIS. This is thought to involve the monoaminergic efferents from the brainstem to the septohippocampal system. It's likely a gross simplification of the actual neurobiology of anxiety. So this is sensitivity related to punishment, avoidance, and motivation. We've then got behavioral approach system, so sensitivity related to the reward approach motivation. Okay. So the behavioral inhibition system, the BIS, predicts an individual's response to anxiety-related cues in the environment. Okay, so it's proposed to be the causal basis for anxiety. So over activation of the BIS over the BAS causes that anxiety. Okay, so too much of this sensitivity, not enough of that. So high activity of the BIS is high sensitivity to non-reward punishment and results in increased avoidance behaviors. So here, this is actually grounded in some results we see from pharmaceutical effects of anxiolytic drugs. Okay. One thing that I've actually read is that one theory is that why people persist in having these anxiety thoughts, even with, say, drugs or therapy and stuff, is because your brain can actually become addicted almost to having an increase of this BIS system and not enough of the BAS. So when everything's fine and there's no reason for anxiety, your body craves the activation of the BIS system. It's one theory. So then we've got avoidance behaviors. Remember we talked about how this is actually very common and good in normal anxiety is avoidance behaviors. That's normal, that's good. However, we also see excessive avoidance behaviors in these anxiety disorders. So avoidance behaviors are intended to limit exposure to agents that influence anxiety, not cut it off altogether. Okay, so they're supposed to be limited. But these avoidance behaviors in anxiety disorders tend to be maladaptive, and they actually serve to reinforce anxiety. Okay, so adaptive avoidance would be if a subject hears rustling, banging outside his home. He's uncertain what it is, so he's then going to probably attend to the noise. He has heightened vigilance. He might investigate to see what's happening, right? Now, maladaptive would hear the same noise and would actually inflate the probability of the threat, be like, it's definitely burglars, can't be a raccoon, and develops excessive vigilance to any creaks or noises they hear now. So even though their housemate normally have creaks and stuff, they are going to hear that and assume it's a burglar. They're also going to neglect safety things, safety signals, so like things that are saying, hey, that's actually fine. And they'll actually then lock themselves in their bedroom instead of going out to investigate. So what they're doing is by avoiding so much, they're not able to resolve the situation. They're left unresolved. So they don't know, was I safe? Was it a raccoon or was it a burglar? Okay. So next time they hear it, they're going to just assume it's a burglar yet again. Okay. They're not going to then be able to be like, oh, it's a raccoon. I know what that sound is. They'll be like, oh, I don't know what that is again. It must be a burglar again. And that kind of reinforces that anxiety. So we also talked about how fear and fear responses, again, are a normal component of anxiety, and, some of it is good. It's also a major component of anxiety disorders, okay? So the core of anxious pathology is the anticipation of cognitive, affective, and behavioral processes to then avoid or reduce the impact of a potential threat. So we're going to increase our certainty regarding the nature, timing, probability of a threat, and this then leads to more efficient allocation of anticipatory responses. Increased uncertainty results in absence or excessive results in aberrant or excessive anticipatory results. Okay, so again, like the examples we just saw, because we don't have a certainty at the end, we are then increasing that anticipatory response next time. Okay. So in both animal and human studies, we actually see this. So some sort of predictable stress, so like a foot shock, tend to be preferred to an unpredictable stress. People like knowing what stress is coming. Okay. So that's why students love a syllabus that tells them exactly when their test is rather than a pop quiz. Everyone hates pop quiz. You can't predict that. Awful, okay? So certainty is great. I can plan for it. But uncertainty, I don't know what to do. I freak out. Hate it, okay? So clinical anxiety is often associated with some disruption of a processing bias towards an overly conservative preparatory behavior. So people they prepare too much, but it tends to not to be very efficient. Okay, so it can be effective, but it's not efficient. So if I say, there's going to be a 3-question quiz, multiple choice quiz on this PowerPoint slide specifically, okay? Some people, normal behavior would be to read this slide maybe a few times. Great, okay? But in clinical anxiety, what they might do is they'll overly prepare. And so they'll read this slide a million times. They'll stay up all night doing this. So it's very effective. They're studying it. They probably can memorize it and repeat it back to me. But it's not efficient. You didn't need to spend that much time. Okay? They might look up other stuff. They might be like, oh, where did she get these citations? Where did she get this information from? And look it all up. Again, it's very effective. You'll ace the test, but it's not efficient. You didn't need to do that. Okay? And that's something that we see in clinical anxieties. People kind of doing more than is necessary, but still getting the same results. Okay. We then have this model, and we're going to see this model in the next PowerPoint slides. It's going to be the biggest model of this unit. Know it, love it, it's great. It's the uncertainty and anticipation model of anxiety, or UAMA. Okay? It says that processes involved in adaptive anticipatory responses to future threats, uncertainty, alterations to which result in maladaptive response and anxiety due to an increased threat expectations. Okay, so you see in the middle here, we have increased threat expectations. Okay, so this is an alternative to Gray's theory. It posits that the central role for uncertainty and anticipation is the heightened expectancies about the probability and cost of future threats. Okay, Now, these elevated expectancies tend to be the result of alterations in the calculation of our expected value and aversive prediction error signaling. Okay? So normally there'd be like proper math to calculate what the threat expectancies are. However, they're saying that in anxiety disorders, the math gets messed up. So we take all of these outside things, and when calculating, we get a larger threat expectancy number than actually there is. And there's a few ways that we can do that, or that do that. Okay, so starting in A, we see that there's an increased. Sorry, I have my notes is different. Okay, sorry about this. So B, we're gonna start with B. Is increased threat attention and hypervigilance. C is deficient safety learning or an inability to inhibit anxious responses in the presence of safety. So you're safe, you should be fine, you still feel like you're not. Okay? And then C, nope, that was C. Okay, then these heightened expectancies and an inability to identify safety in situations of uncertainty then contributes to an elevated cognitive and behavioral avoidance. So that's D. Okay, so C leads to D. B also helps lead to D. You see all the things. And then E, so what this happens is that then we see further difficulties in identifying safety and reducing threat expectancies. Okay, so we now have heightened threat expectancies and an inability to identify our safety signals. And this then contributes to exaggerated physiological and behavioral reactivity under the conditions of uncertainty. Okay? And then finally, A, it's heightened reactivity to uncertainty, which then leads to further avoidance of such conditions. Okay? Ta-da. Okay. Sorry, my numbers or letters were off. Okay, so maladaptive responses to uncertainty. Okay. Inflated estimates of threat and probability. We see hypervigilance, deficient safety learning, behavioral and cognitive avoidance, and heightened reactivity to threat uncertainty. So again, all of this is really just detailing what we see in each step of the UAMA model. Totally how you pronounce that. So, in the inflated estimates of threat, cost, and probability, then we see that anxious individuals tend to have exaggerated assessments of the likelihood of negative events. Okay, so like the likelihood of being struck by lightning, they think is higher than it actually is. Or, going swimming in the ocean, clearly you're going to get eaten by sharks. No, you're not. The likelihood of that is tiny, but in their mind it's larger. Okay. They also tend to have overly pessimistic expectations, and this is connected to judgment bias. So judgment bias is observed in GAD and PTSD, and it tends to relate to an increased cost judgment as opposed to increased probability judgment. Okay, so the cost and probability, like it doesn't cost enough for the risk you're taking, that kind of thing. Or, yeah, it costs too much for the risk, or that kind of thing, okay? We've then got hypervigilance. So this is a heightened perception of harm, tends to view ambiguous stimuli as harmful. So you see a red light, you don't know what the red light means, but you're going to assume it's bad, okay? We call this interpretation bias. This is observed in GAD, PTSD, and SAD, or SAD, seasonal affective disorder. It often has syndrome-specific contexts, so like combat-related cues for veterans with PTSD. Yeah. Deficient safety learning, then we see environmental safety signals will indicate decreased likelihood of a threat and relieve individuals of anticipatory anxiety. With increased uncertainty bias, then the responses actually impair recognition of these safety signals. So safety learning can be demonstrated in conditional discrimination tasks. So we can present a CS plus with a US, like a shock, and with a second Q, so a CS minus, presented only in the absence of the US. So then anxiety disorders and PTSD actually fail to show discrimination between a CS plus and a CS minus, because the CS minus there was no shock associated with it, but they don't know what it means then. They don't get rewarded for it, so, but they also don't get a shock. So what does that mean? It must also be bad. Okay. Behavioral and cognitive avoidance. So this is avoidance behaviors prevent exposure to threat. Excessive avoidance is negatively reinforced. Exposure cues in the absence of a threat can extinguish anxiety behaviors. So avoidance behaviors tend to block this extinction. Okay. So behavioral and cognitive avoidance forms the basis of exposure therapy for fear and anxiety disorders, where repeated exposure to fearful stimuli in the absence of the threat can extinct these anxieties. And then finally, we have heightened reactivity to threat uncertainties. So this is uncertainty about the threat tends to increase the physiological response to the threat. Okay. Panic disorders and PTSD tend to show this exaggerated response to temporally unpredictable threat conditions. So this heightened reactivity can be observed in humans. When we play tones, that's either going to precede a high or low intensity shock, then we show greater startle responses than tones preceding an always high intensity shock. Okay, so when you know that a tone means a high intensity shock, you know what to expect. But when a tone says a shock's coming, but who knows how intense, no matter what, there's gonna be a startle response when you hear the tone, because you can't prepare yourself. You don't know what it's going to be. Okay. So that's it for this first PowerPoint slide for today's lectures. On Monday, we will continue and talk about the different neurobiology that's associated with each of these maladaptive responses to uncertainty.